The room was quiet enough that one could hear the soft clatter of the snow tapping against the infirmary windows, each flake illuminated briefly by the lantern glow before melting into the darkness beyond the glass. It was 1912 in rural Ohio, a winter colder than any the town had seen in years, and inside that small brick building on the edge of the farmland lay a man the world had long forgotten, a man the town refused to fully acknowledge, and a man fate seemed unwilling to release. The nurses moved softly around him, whispering in voices that trembled more from unease than from the cold that seeped through the warped window frames. They spoke of his age the way fearful children speak of a story they want to believe is untrue. Some said he was over 100, others claimed he was far older. A few insisted that he had been old since their grandparents were young. Even the oldest records, scattered across dusty shelves in the courthouse, refused to agree. The young nurse assigned to him that night, May Harding, had only been working at the infirmary for a few months, but already she had heard enough rumors about the old man to make her approach his bedside with cautious reverence. She had been told that sometimes he spoke in ways no one understood. Other times he did not speak at all, as if his mind drifted somewhere far removed from the present. And there were nights, like this one, when he watched the falling snow with a gaze so ancient and tired it made May's breath catch in her throat. She tried to be professional, to ignore the way her pulse quickened each time she stepped into his room, but she could not deny the unsettling weight of his presence. It was as if time itself gathered around him, thick and heavy, refusing to move forward. His name, according to the earliest surviving documents, was Elias Mason, though even that was uncertain. Some claimed he had used other names in the past, names tied to plantations, names whispered in languages no longer spoken. His hands were thin and unnaturally scarred, not just with the marks of age but with lines that looked carved by years of brutal labor. His hair was white but still thick, his skin deeply wrinkled yet strangely firm in places where it should have been fragile. May often found herself staring at the veins along his arms, dark, prominent rivers that looked older than the man they belonged to. When she placed the stethoscope against his chest that night, expecting to hear the faint flutter typical of someone near the end of life, she was startled by the steady rhythm she found instead. His heartbeat was slow, far slower than normal, but strong, as if pulsing from a place untouched by the usual fragility of age. May stepped back, confused, and checked again. The same deep, deliberate thump met her ears. For a moment she wondered if the stories were true, that he had lived through more than a century, that he had survived eras no other living soul could recall, that he carried memories from a world long buried. She pushed the thought away, embarrassed by the irrational fear curling through her stomach, but the doubt lingered. Just as she was about to remove her hand from his wrist, his eyes opened. They were cloudy, but beneath the haze gleamed a sharpness that did not fit the frailty of his body. It was the kind of gaze that had watched seasons change beyond counting, that had seen lives rise and fall, that had endured without release. May tried to smile, but the expression faltered as he turned his head slightly, his voice emerging as a cracked whisper that seemed to travel across decades before reaching her ears. "Still snowing," he said, his voice barely audible. "It snowed the night I left the fields. Cold as this, maybe colder." May swallowed, unsure how to respond. She had learned from the other nurses that Elias slipped in and out of memory without warning, sometimes speaking as if he were a young man still bound to the iron restraints of plantation life. She did not interrupt him. Instead, she leaned closer, letting him speak if he wished. "They told me I would die there," he murmured. "Told me no slave leaves the soil alive. But I didn't die. I told them. I told them I wouldn't die in chains." May felt a chill crawl along her spine. His tone was not nostalgic. It was haunted, edged with a pain so deep it seemed etched into his very breath. She hesitated before placing a warm cloth on his forehead. For a moment he went still, exhausted from the effort of speaking. Then he whispered again, softer this time, as if confessing something meant for no one living. "And I never will." The words lingered in the air longer than they should have, settling around May like frost. She stepped back, unsure if she had heard him correctly. The lantern flickered, casting shadows along the walls, making the room appear older, almost ancient. She glanced at the door, half tempted to fetch the town physician, but she knew he would dismiss her concerns. Dr. Lewis had long considered Elias's strange longevity a matter of exaggerated town gossip. He believed the old man was simply confused, misremembering dates, repeating stories handed down through generations. Nothing more. But May knew what she had heard. And she knew that the fear twisting in her chest did not come from superstition alone. The old man's voice carried something heavy, something unwavering, as if spoken by someone who had endured the impossible. She looked at him again, lying so still beneath the thin blanket, yet somehow radiating a presence that felt far too large for the small infirmary room. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the town in silent white. Inside, May sat beside him, unable to shake the feeling that she was witnessing the final hours of a life that defied history itself, a life that refused to bend to time, to death, or to the chains that once sought to break it. And though she did not yet understand the true weight of what she had heard, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: this man had lived a story the world was not prepared to believe. The town of Marietta, Ohio, lay quiet under a sky smeared with gray and the sharp sting of winter winds that rattled the wooden shutters of homes built a century earlier. Streets twisted unevenly, remnants of old trails that once carried horse-drawn wagons and the hesitant steps of freed men and women seeking safety. The houses, mostly brick and clapboard, leaned against one another like survivors of a long-forgotten storm, their chimneys coughing thin threads of smoke into the freezing air. Even as new factories rose on the outskirts, the core of the town clung stubbornly to the past, as if unwilling to let go of the centuries it had witnessed. It was here, amidst the frostbitten streets and the silent fields that once fed plantations, that Elias Mason became both legend and ghost, a presence the town could not fully acknowledge. The earliest records of him in Marietta were inconsistent, scattered in the margins of censuses and town ledgers, small notations that barely hinted at his existence. One document listed a man named Elias Mason as old and infirm in 1855, yet another placed him still capable of labor in 1871, performing tasks that should have broken a body decades younger. For the townspeople who had glimpsed him, there was always a sense of wrongness about his presence, a subtle dissonance that refused to be ignored. Children whispered about the man who had lived longer than anyone could remember, and elders avoided discussing him directly, as if speaking aloud his name might disturb the fragile order of their memories. Even the post office clerks, who noted births and deaths with clinical precision, seemed uncertain when asked about him. It was as though the town itself had grown wary of recording a life that defied the rules of time. Marietta's architecture bore witness to eras of hope and despair, with brick warehouses standing beside sagging wooden homes, the remnants of a once thriving river trade now abandoned. In the winter of 1910, an old photograph surfaced in the County Historical Society, showing Elias standing beside a street lamp. His hair was white, but his posture straight, his face was lined, but his eyes betrayed a sharpness that suggested he had not aged according to the passage of years around him. Locals who saw the image murmured quietly, as though acknowledging the photograph might summon him from the pages of history back into their streets. There was a collective discomfort, a shared unease that he was a reminder of things they preferred to forget: slavery, injustice, and the slow erosion of human life against the machinery of time. The town's silence became a shroud, enveloping him in shadows that history could not fully erase. Churches in Marietta, old and stoic with tall steeples that scraped the winter sky, were both sanctuaries and sites of quiet judgment. Records show that some ministers refused to admit him to full participation in their congregations, citing age, infirmity, and the sinfulness of claiming a life so unusually long. Others accepted him with tentative reverence, sensing that his presence was both a blessing and a test. In Sunday school classrooms, children were told fragmented stories: a man who had survived chains, a witness to events too distant for adults to verify. The narrative was always incomplete, leaving gaps that imagination eagerly filled with myth. When Elias attended services, he often sat near the back, his posture erect despite frailty, listening with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the stained glass windows into decades of memory beyond the building itself. Neighborhoods whispered their own accounts. The children who played near the river recalled seeing a gaunt figure walking slowly along the icy banks, pausing to watch the frozen currents, his eyes distant and thoughtful. Older residents remembered passing him on the road, observing how he carried himself with a steadiness that betrayed the weakness his body suggested. Farmers who had known him for decades reported seeing him work in small ways, hauling firewood, tending a garden plot, fixing fences, actions that contradicted the narrative of a man too old to perform labor. These accounts grew in number over the years, layering one upon the other, until the impossibility of his longevity became part of the town's collective consciousness, a story whispered behind closed doors and over the crackle of hearth fires. Local newspapers treated him cautiously, publishing brief mentions without deep investigation. An article in the Marietta Gazette in 1905 referred to him only as a venerable resident of the Western Township and noted that his age exceeds the memory of most living citizens. Editors seemed to balance curiosity with apprehension, aware that a deeper scrutiny could draw unwanted attention to a life that straddled centuries. Letters from readers expressed both fascination and disbelief, questioning how a man could remain among them for so long, yet survive the hardships of slavery, war, and disease. The ambiguity allowed the town to protect itself. Acknowledging him fully would be to confront a truth too extraordinary to fit neatly into their orderly understanding of history. The old cemetery on the outskirts of town served as a silent witness to his decades. Gravestones leaned at impossible angles, names fading into moss, the graves of people he had known coming and going across generations. Elias would sometimes walk among them, touching weathered markers as though recalling conversations long silenced. Observers noted his movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, yet nothing in his expression suggested superstition, only memory, deep and relentless. He was at once part of the town and apart from it, a living bridge between eras that had no right to meet. Children dared each other to follow him, yet no one could match his slow, deliberate pace, or the sense of purpose that seemed to propel him forward despite his years. By the time the winter of 1912 arrived, Marietta had long since accepted him as both fixture and enigma. Doors would open just a fraction wider when he passed, yet windows would shutter silently behind him. Shopkeepers offered him coin for goods, but never pressed for conversation. Neighbors recognized his presence without acknowledging it aloud. He existed in a space suspended between human experience and myth, a man whose very survival challenged the town's understanding of time, mortality, and history. The silence that enveloped him was not mere ignorance, it was a carefully maintained agreement, a way for a town to coexist with a life that refused to conform, a life that held within its shadows the living could not fully grasp, and questions they were too afraid to answer. The memory of the plantation stretched across Elias Mason's mind like a landscape too vast to contain, a scar of heat, dirt, and the incessant rhythm of toil that had defined his earliest years. He could recall the clay-laden fields of the South, the oppressive sun pressing down on the backs of men and women bound in chains, the overseer's voice cracking like a whip across the rows of crops. Every detail remained vivid, the smell of the earth after rain, the sting of lash marks, the hushed murmurs of those who shared fleeting moments of resistance and solidarity. It was a memory that refused to fade, as if time itself had folded around him, preserving fragments of the past in startling clarity. Those who later spoke with him remarked on the precision of his recollections, names of enslaved families long erased from records, the sequence of daily tasks dictated by owners who no longer lived, and even the private rituals he and others performed in secret to maintain a fragile sense of dignity. Elias's earliest years were dominated by labor that shaped not only his body but the contours of his mind. He recalled the planting and harvesting cycles, the bitter cold of winters when food was scarce, and the unrelenting authority of those who claimed ownership over human lives. He had seen men broken, women beaten, children sold away like objects. He had learned to navigate fear and obedience while holding in his chest a quiet, unyielding determination to survive. Some of his memories were tinged with moments of fleeting joy, a stolen apple shared between friends, the hush of night when they sang songs forbidden by law, but these were fleeting against the backdrop of suffering. Even now, decades later, the sensations returned with astonishing immediacy, the calluses on his hands, the sunburn on his neck, the taste of river water when there was nothing else to drink. These details, so precise and intimate, confounded later historians who tried to reconcile them with the man's claimed age and the timelines of the plantations he described. Escape had once been an abstract concept, a whisper in the night among those daring enough to imagine freedom. Elias remembered the failed attempt, the night he had slipped away under the cover of darkness with 2 companions, hearts pounding and breath sharp with fear. They had navigated forests and creeks, trusting the shadows to conceal them, but betrayal and circumstance had intervened. One companion was caught, another vanished into the unknown, and Elias himself had barely returned to the plantation alive. The memory of that night haunted him not for its failure, but for the knowledge it imparted. Survival demanded cunning, patience, and a readiness to endure suffering that would stretch decades beyond the immediate moment. He carried the lessons of that night forward, their weight accumulating with each passing year. Elias also remembered the rare acts of kindness that had punctuated the harshness of slavery, a fellow slave sharing a portion of bread, a visiting missionary reading words of comfort from a distant world, a quiet smile exchanged under the oppressive gaze of overseers. These moments seemed almost surreal in memory, like glimpses of a world beyond suffering, yet they had imprinted themselves indelibly upon his consciousness. In the small Ohio towns where he later lived, he would sometimes speak of these fleeting gestures, though listeners often struggled to reconcile the humanity in his recollections with the brutality he described. It was as if his life contained 2 parallel histories, one of unyielding oppression, another of subtle resilience and survival. The plantation's geography, too, lived within him. He could trace the paths between cabins and fields, recall the location of wells and the pattern of the creek that wound through the land. He knew which trees marked the boundaries and which stones indicated hidden footpaths, details that he would recount with uncanny accuracy decades later. Scholars attempting to verify his narratives were stunned by the precision, unable to explain how a man whose recorded birthdate supposedly post-dated some of these landmarks could retain such knowledge. Even small items, the texture of worn boards, the smell of freshly cut hay, the precise angle of the sun at midday, he could summon in words that seemed to animate the past for those willing to listen. His recollections were not merely descriptive, they carried emotional resonance, a layering of trauma and adaptation. He spoke of the fear that had been constant, the whispered strategies for survival, and the quiet moments of rebellion that had sustained him. In these retellings, he conveyed the paradox of a life simultaneously brutal and rich with endurance, of a consciousness sharpened by hardship yet tempered by compassion for those enduring alongside him. He would recount how enslaved families taught children to memorize songs that contained coded instructions for escape, how simple objects, stones, knots in rope, the alignment of trees, became instruments of survival. Every memory was a lesson, a warning, a testament to human resilience under impossible circumstances. Elias's ability to recall this past in such vivid detail created unease in those who listened. It was not simply that he remembered, it was that his memories seemed impossibly accurate, too precise to be filtered through decades of human forgetfulness. Visitors from nearby towns, curious students, and local journalists often left conversations shaken, noting how he could describe events and people they could not corroborate, how he seemed to possess knowledge of generations before their own grandparents had been born. Some whispered that he was exaggerating, inventing stories for attention. Others believed his longevity was tied to the intensity of his recollections, that the act of remembering so completely had somehow arrested the progression of time in his body, even as it carried him through an unbroken chain of survival. The memories also carried shadows that refused to be dissipated. Faces of lost companions, cries of the oppressed, the relentless gaze of those who enforced cruelty, all returned to him in vivid detail, haunting his nights and shaping his days. Even in Ohio, where freedom was a promise realized, he carried the spectral weight of his youth, the echoes of plantations long gone but preserved in the fibers of his memory. To speak of them was to relive them, yet he did so with a composure that unnerved those around him. There was a quiet authority in his voice, a command born from having witnessed centuries of suffering and survival, a knowledge that transcended ordinary human experience. And so, as he aged in Marietta, this past remained not only a memory but a living presence, an invisible companion shaping his interactions, his reflections, and the way the town perceived him. Those who listened closely sensed that they were hearing more than stories, they were hearing the pulse of history itself, carried forward in a single, improbable life. It was both a gift and a burden, and it was what made Elias Mason unforgettable, a man whose memories exceeded the limits of normal human life, anchoring him in a reality that seemed impossible yet undeniably true. By the time Elias Mason reached adulthood, the whispers of impossibility had begun to trail him, shadows that clung to his movements as he navigated Ohio's small towns. People noticed subtle signs that set him apart from other men, behaviors too measured, eyes too keen, and a body that bore the marks of decades yet seemed to resist the finality of decline. Children stared longer than they should, adults whispered quietly behind closed doors, and neighbors shared uneasy glances when he passed by. The earliest indications were almost imperceptible, a hand steadier than it had any right to be, a gait that betrayed strength despite years of backbreaking labor, a memory of names, places, and events that stretched back farther than any living record should allow. His longevity began as quiet speculation, but the patterns became too persistent to ignore. Farmers who had watched him work reported a consistency that defied logic. While most men his age required the help of younger hands, Elias carried loads without complaint, repaired tools with a precision that seemed unlearned, and performed tasks that left witnesses questioning the passage of time. One account, recorded in a private journal, described him walking to the town well before dawn, drawing water for neighbors too infirm to rise, and returning to his small cabin with the same energy displayed by men half his age. Another observer recounted seeing him carry a wounded horse to safety during a spring flood, an act of stamina and awareness that appeared beyond the reach of normal human endurance. Rumors began to spread, not as deliberate tales, but as uneasy acknowledgments that the man had somehow slipped beyond the natural bounds of life. Even his voice carried a weight of antiquity. Conversations with him often felt like stepping into a different era, his speech carried words and inflections long abandoned, phrases that hinted at knowledge of events decades removed from the present. Those who spoke with him sometimes caught themselves wondering if they were conversing with a living man or a specter conjured from history itself. Visitors from nearby towns and curious travelers came seeking to verify his age, asking questions that ranged from the mundane to the impossible. He would answer patiently, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with sorrow, recounting details of plantation life, journeys northward, and the faces of companions who had long since vanished. Each answer reinforced the impossible impression: here was a man who had not only survived, but retained, with startling clarity, the entirety of a life that spanned generations. The first recorded instance of public recognition came in 1869 when a traveling merchant noted in a ledger that Elias appeared older than any living resident, yet capable of remarkable labor. The observation, meant to be casual, sparked murmurs among the townspeople. They observed that while most men his age faltered, Elias displayed no decline commensurate with his supposed years. Over the next decade, additional witnesses added to the evidence, each account slightly differing in detail yet aligned in implication: he did not age in the expected manner. Skeptics dismissed these accounts as exaggeration, gossip amplified by fear, or miscalculation of his birth date, yet the frequency and consistency of reports made such dismissals increasingly untenable. The pattern could no longer be ignored. Church records reveal a subtle tension developing around him. Ministers debated how to treat a man whose existence challenged conventional understandings of life and mortality. Some viewed him as blessed, a living testament to divine providence; others feared that his prolonged presence carried a portentous weight, a reminder of sins too long hidden. Children were told stories of his survival in fragments, carefully curated to instill respect without invoking unease. These fragments grew into whispered legends, circulating beneath the surface of everyday life. Townspeople left doors slightly ajar, hesitated before acknowledging his presence, and spoke in quiet tones when recounting his feats. The invisible web of awareness created an atmosphere thick with anticipation, a sense that the man's life was a story not fully understood, yet impossible to dismiss. Medical observations began to accumulate, however fragmentary. Local doctors noted the peculiar resilience of his body, skin that retained surprising elasticity, bones that bore decades of labor without severe degeneration, a digestive system resistant to the ailments common among men of advanced age. In 1883, one physician commented in his private notes that Elias's reflexes were unusually sharp, his memory unusually precise, his endurance unusual enough to warrant curiosity, though the doctor ultimately dismissed his findings for fear of ridicule from colleagues. Even without formal study, the town slowly came to recognize that his longevity was not merely anecdotal, it was embodied in the rhythms of his daily life, the consistency of his abilities, and the quiet authority with which he navigated the world. Neighbors recalled that Elias seemed attuned to the passage of time in ways others were not. He anticipated storms, sensed subtle shifts in seasons, and remembered details of agricultural cycles that younger men could not recall. This sensitivity extended to social patterns. He would recall the lineage of families long after records had been lost, remember names and faces no one else recalled, and recount events from decades earlier with the clarity of personal experience rather than second-hand report. His awareness gave him an almost uncanny presence in the town, as though he were simultaneously part of its current life and its entire historical memory. People found themselves watching him more closely than they intended, noting small gestures, patterns of movement, and the rhythm of his day. The town's perception of him shifted from curiosity to something heavier, something uneasy, as if he were a living monument to a past they could neither fully understand nor comfortably forget. Even the children, who once followed him with fascination, began to sense the strangeness of his being. They whispered in corners about how he could remember their great-grandparents' names, how he knew things no adult had told him, and how his eyes seemed to see not only the present but the decades that had passed. Their fascination carried a tremor of fear, a recognition that Elias Mason was not merely old, but somehow other, a man whose life defied the natural order. It was this sense, half awe and half dread, that threaded through the town, giving rise to stories that would later be catalogued in private journals, letters, and oral histories, forming the foundation of a narrative that blurred the line between reality and myth. And so, with each passing year, the town became increasingly aware of a man whose existence was impossible, yet undeniable. He moved quietly among them, performing simple tasks, maintaining routine, and observing life with eyes that held centuries of memory. His presence challenged the assumptions of biology, history, and human understanding, quietly unraveling the linear narrative of life around him. It was in these early signs, subtle yet persistent, that the town began to realize the truth. Elias Mason was no ordinary man, and the life he carried within him was one that history could neither measure nor fully comprehend. The murmurs of Marietta's townspeople grew louder over the years, not in public proclamations but in subtle gestures and quiet glances exchanged across porches and marketplace stalls. Word of Elias Mason's unnatural longevity had begun to circulate beyond the narrow confines of those who knew him personally. Church elders whispered behind closed doors, debating the propriety of his presence at Sunday services. Some feared that his extended life was a test, a reflection of sins long buried yet unresolved. Others felt that he had been blessed, preserved as a living testament to endurance, a relic of a past that was meant to instruct rather than unsettle. The ambiguity of his existence created tension, leaving the community caught between reverence and discomfort, fascination and unease. Religious leaders, in particular, struggled with how to interpret his life. Sermons occasionally referenced him obliquely, framing him as a symbol of divine patience or moral rectitude, though always carefully, so as not to draw direct attention that might disturb the congregation's equilibrium. A few ministers proposed that he was touched by providence, a man whose long life was a message to the faithful, while others warned that it might be a test of humility, a reminder that the sins of the past could linger far longer than anticipated. The conflict filtered down through parishioners, creating layers of whispered speculation. Small groups gathered after services to debate the meaning of his existence, half in hope, half in fear. They spoke of blessings and curses with equal gravity, each interpretation reflecting their own unease with a man whose life refused to adhere to the ordinary rhythms of time. Meanwhile, Elias himself remained composed, an observer of the tension rather than a participant. He moved through the town with quiet dignity, tending to modest routines, performing small acts of kindness, and offering advice to those who sought it. Yet even these gestures were interpreted as portentous by those around him. A simple act of lending a hand with chores, or sharing a piece of wisdom about farming or household management, was magnified into something extraordinary. Neighbors whispered that he carried secrets of the past no one else could know, that he had seen horrors and miracles alike, and that his presence was a bridge between eras too distant for ordinary understanding. Children approached with awe and fear in equal measure, adults with respect laced with unease. His very comportment suggested a knowledge that was simultaneously grounding and unnerving. The gossip in town grew more intricate as Elias aged, taking on the texture of folklore. Some claimed he had been born before the Civil War and survived every battle, every outbreak of disease, every hardship that had claimed his peers. Others argued he must have made a pact or encountered forces beyond mortal understanding to explain his longevity. Even the local doctor, a man of reason and empirical study, found himself uneasy when Elias described details of medicine, agriculture, and social structures that predated written records. Observations and explanations failed to align, leaving the townspeople with an unsettling ambiguity. A man lived among them, a man they could see and touch, yet whose life stretched beyond all logic and documentation. The townspeople's reactions were not uniform. Some displayed admiration, approaching him with a cautious respect that bordered on reverence. They offered food, sought advice, and listened intently to stories of distant plantations, enslaved families, and forgotten landscapes. Others regarded him with suspicion, believing his unnatural longevity was unnatural in every sense, a disruption to the moral and temporal order. They avoided him, withheld conversation, or spoke in half-truths and coded language to prevent revealing their doubts or fears. Within this social tension, Elias navigated carefully, never asserting himself, never correcting perceptions, only existing within the limits allowed by a community struggling to reconcile curiosity, guilt, and awe. The children of Marietta were particularly drawn to him, not simply for the novelty of his age but for the vividness of his storytelling. He recounted events from decades prior with a precision that bewildered and enchanted, describing journeys across rivers, nights spent hiding from slave catchers, and the daily rhythms of plantation life that seemed at once distant and immediate. They would sit for hours on the frozen ground, listening to his voice carry the texture of other centuries, imagining themselves present in places they could scarcely comprehend. Yet even in these moments of engagement, there was an undercurrent of fear, a sense that the man before them belonged to a time they could not reach, that his life carried a weight they could not measure. His presence was a lesson in both history and mortality, offered without judgment, and received with a mixture of fascination and dread. Local newspapers began to note him in passing, though always with caution. Articles referenced a venerable resident whose years surpass ordinary counting, describing him as remarkable, without providing concrete detail. Editors walked a careful line, acknowledging curiosity without inviting ridicule. Correspondence from readers expressed disbelief, awe, and, in some cases, subtle fear, reinforcing the idea that Elias Mason had become more than a man. He had become an idea, a symbol, a puzzle that the town could not solve but could not ignore. His life was now woven into the fabric of Marietta, both an anchor to its past and a challenge to its present understanding. Even within his own household, where he was known and quietly respected, Elias's presence provoked debate. Younger residents speculated endlessly about how he had survived, proposing theories of secret remedies, supernatural intervention, or sheer fortitude. Older residents, those who had watched generations pass beneath his gaze, sometimes murmured about endurance and divine purpose. Few dared to question him directly, for fear that inquiry might provoke an answer too complex or disturbing to bear. Over time, this layer of unspoken negotiation created a tension that mirrored the wider town's unease. His existence could not be denied, yet it could not be fully comprehended. By the turn of the century, his presence had cemented itself as a living contradiction. He was an ordinary man in daily routines, yet extraordinary in the impossibility of his lifespan. He was visible, tactile, and fully human, yet his memory, knowledge, and endurance placed him beyond natural constraints. The town learned to adjust around him, incorporating his presence into routines while respecting the silent distance his life demanded. Children learned to speak softly when near him, adults to acknowledge him with subtle gestures, and townspeople collectively absorbed the dissonance without resolution. He had become simultaneously integrated and otherworldly, a figure whose simple acts, walking through streets, offering assistance, recounting the past, carried weight far beyond ordinary comprehension. It was in this slow-burning tension that the town's awareness crystallized. Elias Mason was not just old, he was impossible. Every observation, every small interaction, every whispered account reinforced the sense that a man had survived far longer than any reasonable measure allowed, carrying within him a lifetime of memory and endurance that exceeded human expectation. And while the town adjusted to his presence, accommodated his peculiarities, and preserved a careful silence about his extraordinary life, the collective consciousness understood something fundamental, that this man, whose existence straddled centuries, carried with him the quiet, unsettling proof that time was not as orderly, predictable, or finite as they had always believed. In Marietta, his life was a shadow on the wall, a persistent reminder of the fragility of assumption and the relentless persistence of memory. The town of Marietta had grown accustomed to Elias Mason's presence, yet his daily life was far from static. Each morning, before the sun fully crested the horizon, he would rise and walk to the edge of the town where the fields met the frozen river. The snow crunched beneath his worn boots, and the air, sharp and bitter, filled his lungs with a clarity that seemed almost unnatural for a man of his years. He moved with deliberate care, every step measured, as though the rhythm of the world had slowed to accommodate him. Neighbors who caught glimpses of him on these morning walks often paused mid-task, noting how steady and precise his motions remained, and whispered among themselves that no ordinary man could sustain such strength. Yet he carried on without acknowledgement, never breaking the silence that had grown around him through decades of observation and speculation. His interactions within the community were always understated, yet they bore weight far beyond their apparent simplicity. He would assist farmers with tasks that others would have considered laborious, offering guidance without instruction, and correcting small errors with a soft authority that commanded respect. Shopkeepers found his visits peculiar. He asked questions about deliveries, supplies, and goods with knowledge that suggested experience stretching far beyond what records could corroborate. When children lingered at his side, he spoke with patience and clarity, weaving lessons of survival, endurance, and awareness into his stories, each word carrying the gravity of someone who had observed centuries of human behavior. Yet even in these moments of ordinary generosity, the weight of his longevity hung in the air, shaping the perceptions of those who encountered him. Medical practitioners continued to observe him in quiet, tentative ways, though none dared declare publicly the impossibility of his condition. The town physician, Dr. Whitmore, recorded notes on Elias's blood pressure, pulse, and reflexes, each observation challenging assumptions about human frailty. At 70, Dr. Whitmore would later reflect privately that Elias's endurance, memory, and responsiveness seemed unearthly. Bones that should have shown pronounced deterioration were firm, skin, though wrinkled, retained a subtle elasticity, and cognitive function remained sharp, with recall extending to events and details far predating the physician's own lifetime. Dr. Whitmore's private journals suggest he began to fear not the man himself but the implications of his continued existence, that human longevity could, under unknown circumstances, defy natural law. The sense of dread was subtle, but it suffused every encounter with an awareness that the ordinary rules of life might no longer apply. Even within his modest home, Elias's life reflected a quiet adherence to routine, but also an awareness of impermanence. He kept meticulous records of tasks completed, daily observations of the weather, and detailed sketches of the natural landscape surrounding Marietta. Occasionally, he would add annotations about the passage of neighboring families, the growth of trees, or the decay of abandoned structures, each note serving as a testament to the passage of time that had otherwise eluded him. Visitors who glimpsed these records were struck by their precision and scope, though few dared ask him about them directly. The documents themselves became a silent archive, bridging decades of history while revealing nothing of the supernatural, yet hinting at a consciousness operating on a scale that far exceeded ordinary comprehension. In social settings, Elias's presence inspired both admiration and anxiety. Town gatherings, festivals, and markets were marked by a peculiar tension whenever he appeared. People spoke softly in his vicinity, often deferring to him in subtle ways, offering gestures of respect that suggested acknowledgement of experience they could not quantify. Elders watched him carefully, noting his demeanor, the accuracy of his memory, and the subtle intelligence in his observations. Children, drawn to his stories, often failed to perceive the undercurrent of unease that rippled through adults. Conversations about the past were carefully navigated, for many felt that any discussion of slavery, survival, or historical trauma touched nerves too raw to confront directly. In this, Elias acted as both bridge and mirror, connecting the living with forgotten history while reflecting the town's discomfort with its own past. Even as the decades passed, subtle anomalies persisted in his behavior. He would awaken before dawn with remarkable consistency, traverse long distances without visible fatigue, and anticipate events that others did not see coming. Storms, mechanical failures, and seasonal changes seemed to register differently with him, as though his awareness was attuned to patterns invisible to ordinary observers. Small acts of kindness, bringing food to an elderly neighbor, fixing a broken fence, advising a family on planting schedules, were imbued with a sense of quiet authority, signaling to the community that he existed within natural laws yet somehow operated beyond them. People interpreted these actions in varied ways, some as divine providence, others as evidence of unnatural endurance, all agreeing that Elias Mason was a presence that defied easy categorization. Despite this, isolation shadowed him. The very consistency that inspired awe also bred caution, creating distance between him and those who might have drawn closer. Families who welcomed his counsel remained careful not to probe too deeply into his past, and children eventually learned the boundaries of inquiry. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when he seemed to speak to unseen companions, murmuring phrases under his breath or recalling details that no one else could verify. These episodes were rare, but they reinforced the sense that his consciousness carried both memory and weight beyond human reckoning. Observers could not determine whether these utterances were hallucinations, fragments of memory, or remnants of events too vast to contain within ordinary human experience. His psychological resilience was extraordinary, yet it bore the subtle strain of centuries. Nights were sometimes restless, filled with dreams of places he had known, labor he had endured, and faces long gone. He would rise quietly, walking the perimeter of his home or sitting by the fire to organize thoughts and sketches, each action methodical, deliberate, and precise. Visitors rarely witnessed these moments, but those who did described a calm presence tempered by an underlying tension, a quiet testimony to the internal labor of a mind sustained over decades. These glimpses revealed that longevity, while remarkable, was not without its burdens. Memory, endurance, and awareness combined to create a weight that demanded solitude, reflection, and measured interaction with the living world. By 1905, the town's perception of Elias Mason had solidified into a complex mixture of reverence, fear, and resignation. His life was observed, documented in private journals, and whispered about in church basements and marketplaces. He had become a living archive, a bridge between past and present, embodying events and memories that the community could not fully reconcile with ordinary understanding. Those who encountered him were left to navigate the tension between his visible humanity and the impossible implications of his longevity, uncertain whether they were witnessing a man, a legend, or a combination of both. The town continued to adjust, simultaneously accepting his presence while preserving the careful silence that had grown around him for decades, a silence weighted with awe, unease, and the quiet recognition of human limits challenged. As Elias Mason aged through the decades, the small town of Marietta began to view his existence through the lens of explanation, though no explanation could satisfy reason entirely. Scholars, curious travelers, and physicians occasionally visited, attempting to uncover a logical framework for his continued vitality. They proposed theories rooted in biology, a slow metabolism, exceptional genetic inheritance, or a resistance to disease that had eluded scientific understanding. They noted his pulse, his reflexes, his memory, attempting to anchor the extraordinary in measurable phenomena. Yet each hypothesis faltered under scrutiny, as his resilience extended beyond any known model of human endurance. The meticulous observers left perplexed, recording what they could and leaving questions that hung in the air like a winter fog, heavy and persistent. Elias himself never corrected or guided the speculation. He spoke with quiet honesty when questioned but never sought to prove anything, letting the observers record their own interpretations of his life. When asked about his longevity, he would offer simple responses, anecdotes of diet, work, and careful attention to routine, though none fully accounted for the enduring vitality that had become the subject of such fascination. Travelers were often left with a sense that his life contained more than mere physiology, that memory, experience, and perhaps an innate attunement to the rhythms of the world had played roles too subtle to quantify. In these interactions, he remained calm, never defensive, as if the persistence of his own life rendered all attempts at explanation simultaneously trivial and incomplete. Attempts to reconcile his age with documented history frequently led to frustration. Town records, census data, and letters offered fragmented accounts, often contradictory, and historians found themselves caught in an impossible mesh of dates and events. He could recall details of the early 1800s, places and families that had vanished long before his interactions with contemporary observers, yet formal records sometimes conflicted with his testimony. Even with corroborative evidence, the consistency of his recollections surpassed what conventional timelines allowed. Each verification added weight to the impossible, and each contradiction deepened the mystery, leaving the town and visiting scholars suspended between admiration, disbelief, and a creeping unease that grew with every passing year. Scientific theories abounded, many rooted in early notions of longevity as an anomaly of nature rather than evidence of something extraordinary. One physician suggested a rare form of cellular resilience, while another proposed that a combination of diet, environmental factors, and low-stress living could account for his endurance. Local pharmacists were consulted, adding suggestions of tonic treatments and herbal remedies that might have contributed to longevity. Elias listened politely to each proposition, offering small corrections or personal observations, but the visitors invariably left puzzled, unable to reconcile the full scale of his life with the limits of contemporary science. His existence remained an enigma, a quiet contradiction to empirical expectations that dominated every conversation about human lifespan. Visitors who sought understanding also observed his psychological resilience, which appeared as remarkable as his physical vitality. He demonstrated memory recall that stretched across generations, describing in precise detail events that predated living witnesses. He remembered conversations, natural phenomena, and social customs with an accuracy that defied ordinary cognition. These abilities drew curiosity from researchers who attempted rudimentary tests, probing his memory, attentiveness, and awareness of chronology. Each test reinforced the same observation: Elias Mason's mind had retained a clarity, a consistency, and a depth that bordered on impossibility. Observers were left with a sense that his consciousness was a repository, an archive of lived history whose capacity far exceeded ordinary human experience. Even folklore began to weave itself around the idea of explanation. Townspeople speculated quietly in private about divine intervention, supernatural endurance, or ancestral protection. Some suggested he had made a pact with a higher power, survived curses and plagues, or was protected by unknown forces beyond human understanding. Others preferred rational theories, emphasizing diet, work habits, and mental acuity as the keys to his longevity. These discussions rarely occurred in public, for fear of attracting ridicule or skepticism, yet they permeated the consciousness of Marietta. Elias himself remained neutral, silent on any metaphysical implications, allowing interpretations to arise organically from observation and rumor rather than deliberate proclamation. The limits of medical understanding and social interpretation left his life in an ambiguous space, bridging science, folklore, and lived reality. Doctors could record his pulse, observers could note his endurance, historians could verify fragments of his past, yet no combination of evidence could fully explain the coherence of his existence. Each visitor left with new observations, yet none could reconcile all elements into a single narrative. This tension became a defining aspect of his later life, Elias existed as a point of convergence for science, myth, and memory, a living paradox that challenged both empirical scrutiny and human imagination. The town accepted him, adjusted around him, yet could not fully integrate him into conventional understanding. During long evenings, when the streets of Marietta were silent and only the distant river murmured beneath winter ice, Elias reflected quietly on the nature of observation itself. He understood the attempts to explain him, to measure and define his longevity, and regarded them with calm detachment. Observers saw his composure and assumed wisdom, yet few grasped the weight of unbroken memory, the burden of living far longer than peers, and the subtle isolation it imposed. To retain clarity across decades was to witness cycles of life, joy, and death repeatedly, each observation reinforcing the delicate impermanence of others' lives while he persisted. It was a knowledge he bore without complaint, though not without solitude, a quiet awareness that separated him from those who attempted to comprehend him. And yet, he remained present in the community, participating in rituals, lending assistance, and recounting memories with precision and patience. The duality of being both part of the town and apart from it created a tension palpable to all who encountered him. Children were captivated by his stories, elders wary of his insight, and visitors often left unsettled by the undeniable evidence of a life extending beyond ordinary human comprehension. Each interaction reinforced the persistent question, how could one man embody so much history, endurance, and clarity without succumbing to the inevitable decay that governed all other lives? No answer emerged, only layered observations, fragments of documentation, and the quiet certainty of his continued existence. By the late 19th century, Elias Mason had become a symbol of both possibility and mystery. Attempts to explain his life through scientific observation, historical verification, and folklore speculation were ongoing, yet none offered resolution. The town, scholars, and travelers had all come to the same tentative understanding: his life was both real and impossible, documented yet elusive, human yet extraordinary. Each new visitor, each recorded observation, and each whispered conversation contributed to the growing legend, while the man himself moved through it with calm persistence, embodying the enigma he had long become. His existence challenged the frameworks of understanding, leaving a legacy that was both profoundly ordinary and startlingly impossible, a life that would continue to evoke awe and speculation for generations to come. As the years advanced into the early 20th century, the life of Elias Mason became increasingly intertwined with the collective consciousness of Marietta, yet always at a distance, a presence that was simultaneously part of the town and apart from it. Streets that had once been familiar became the backdrop for a subtle theater in which his existence was both observed and quietly measured. Farmers noted the regularity of his steps, the precision of his labor, and the unwavering endurance of a man whose body seemed impervious to time. Each action, no matter how mundane, was imbued with a quiet significance, reinforcing the sense that Elias's life was a living testament to a reality that eluded conventional understanding. Even as the town evolved, new homes, expanding factories, and shifting populations, his figure remained a constant, unaltered by the passage of decades, a silent witness to the unfolding of history. The local schools, which had grown in number and size, occasionally welcomed him to speak of the past, though always under careful supervision. Children sat in hushed rows, eyes wide, ears attuned to the cadence of his storytelling. He described the landscapes of his youth with a vividness that seemed to animate the room: the sway of cornfields under summer heat, the distant cries of animals, the rhythm of river currents that had once guided the steps of those fleeing bondage. He spoke of both cruelty and compassion, of fear and resilience, conveying lessons not as moral instruction but as lived experience. Teachers noted the impact on students, many of whom left with an unsettling mix of awe and unease, recognizing that they were hearing testimony from a life that stretched across centuries, a life that bore witness to eras no textbook could fully capture. Elias's interaction with the broader community continued to highlight the contradictions of his existence. On market days, he would stroll among stalls, greeting merchants with precise recollections of transactions from decades prior, remembering both customers and the minutiae of supply chains long since altered. Farmers sought his advice on planting schedules, weather predictions, and equipment maintenance, often noting with quiet astonishment how his suggestions reflected not only practical knowledge but an almost instinctual understanding of patterns extending beyond ordinary experience. Observers remarked that even his silence carried authority, a weight that shaped behavior and perception without overt assertion. His very presence recalibrated expectations of what it meant to endure, to observe, and to participate in the continuity of life. Medical scrutiny remained a quiet undercurrent. Physicians, though cautious, continued to examine him in private. Blood pressure, pulse, and reflex tests offered data that seemed normal at first glance but became increasingly anomalous in the context of his age. Cognitive assessments highlighted an astonishing retention of detail, from precise dates of historical events to the recollection of conversations with individuals long deceased. The more Elias's life was examined, the more it challenged the frameworks of conventional science. Reports circulated quietly among colleagues, often prefaced by disclaimers or couched in conjecture, yet the evidence accumulated steadily. His existence became a point of tension between empirical observation and the limitations of understanding, a human life that persistently defied expectation. Socially, his interactions became a mirror for the town's evolving self-perception. Adults who encountered him reflected on generational continuity, comparing their own lifespans with the persistent vitality of a man whose youth seemed distant but unbroken. Children learned to approach him with a mixture of curiosity and restraint, guided by the example of their elders. Stories and rumors evolved, layering myth over memory, blending historical fact with the interpretive gaps left by decades of observation. In quiet corners, conversations speculated about secret habits, unknown remedies, or hidden knowledge, attempting to rationalize the apparent anomaly. Yet no speculation fully captured the essence of his life, leaving the town suspended between recognition and disbelief, observation and conjecture. Even minor incidents became sites of fascination. Neighbors noted how he could traverse long distances without fatigue, anticipate weather patterns with unusual accuracy, and demonstrate an endurance in labor that exceeded common human limits. These observations, repeated across multiple decades, solidified his reputation as both remarkable and impossible. Yet Elias remained grounded in daily routine, performing tasks with unremarkable modesty. He did not boast, and he did not solicit attention, allowing the town to project its curiosity and unease onto the framework of his life without offering explanation beyond what was directly observable. His consistency became both a comfort and a source of tension, reinforcing the sense that the ordinary boundaries of life did not fully apply to him. Letters and occasional newspaper mentions began to document his presence more broadly, though often with caution. Descriptions of his physical vitality, precision, and memory circulated among scholars and curious observers from other towns. Articles tended to be circumspect, emphasizing longevity without providing concrete verification, reflecting a persistent unease with asserting claims that defied conventional understanding. Correspondents expressed admiration, disbelief, and subtle fear, the combination reinforcing the enigmatic aura that surrounded him. Even as time progressed, each new observation layered additional complexity onto the narrative, ensuring that his life could not be neatly categorized or dismissed. The psychological dimension of his existence was subtle but profound. Decades of observation had instilled in Elias a quiet awareness of human behavior and social dynamics. He seemed attuned to unspoken tensions, anticipating questions, reactions, and expectations without verbal prompts. This awareness shaped interactions in ways unnoticed by most observers, reinforcing the perception that he possessed insight extending beyond ordinary experience. Children sensed it instinctively, adults apprehended it consciously, and visitors often experienced it as an unsettling clarity. It was not supernatural, nor explicitly contrived, it was the product of a mind that had witnessed centuries of human life, memory, and consequence, functioning with precision honed through both observation and endurance. By 1910, his presence had become inseparable from the identity of Marietta itself. Townspeople adjusted routines and expectations around him without overt acknowledgement. Doors opened slightly wider, conversations softened, and tasks were sometimes deferred or adapted in anticipation of his advice. Children approached with respect, elders with cautious deference, and outsiders with curiosity tinged by disbelief. In every interaction, Elias Mason served as a living reminder that time was not linear, that human life could persist beyond expected bounds, and that memory, endurance, and observation could converge to create a life simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. The subtle tension, the persistent curiosity, and the quiet awe collectively defined both his role and the town's understanding of what it meant to coexist with a man whose life defied convention. The passing years brought a quiet tension to Marietta, a sense that the ordinary rhythms of the town were subtly measured against the enduring presence of Elias Mason. His movements, routine yet precise, were observed with curiosity and awe. Children whispered among themselves as he walked past, noting how his stride remained steady while the younger men of the town grew weary. Adults measured their own vitality against his, recognizing the stark contrast between the predictable decline of ordinary bodies and the persistence of his. Each morning, he could be seen tending to small tasks, repairing fences, carrying buckets of water from the river, checking the condition of crops, or walking the paths that had long since faded from maps. These actions, though simple, carried with them the weight of decades, a visual testament to the endurance that defied explanation. The town had grown accustomed to his presence, yet they remained haunted by the quiet enigma of his life, aware that time flowed differently for him than for anyone else. The phenomenon of his longevity extended beyond physical endurance. Memory remained as sharp as ever, a living archive that confounded observers and historians alike. He could recall the names of families long erased from records, the exact sequence of events from decades past, and the smallest details of lives that had vanished. These recollections were neither embellished nor flawed by the distortions of age, they were precise, meticulous, and startling in their accuracy. Scholars who visited attempted to verify the information, consulting town records, letters, and oral histories, only to find that while many details aligned, others could not be corroborated. This ambiguity heightened the sense of mystery surrounding him, placing him at the intersection of history, memory, and human perception, a figure who simultaneously existed within and beyond the constraints of ordinary time. Interactions with the townspeople reflected a delicate balance between reverence and fear. His advice on agriculture, construction, or household management was sought after yet approached with caution. Farmers listened intently, respecting the insights drawn from years of observation, yet they whispered to one another about the impossibility of his knowledge. Shopkeepers and tradespeople treated his presence with polite attentiveness, aware that he possessed an awareness of details long forgotten or overlooked. Children approached him with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation, sensing the weight of his experience even as they hung on every word. Each encounter reinforced the paradox of Elias Mason, a man entirely human in form, yet somehow beyond the ordinary parameters of mortality. Medical scrutiny continued in a discreet and persistent manner. Dr. Whitmore and other visiting physicians documented physiological markers, heart rate, reflexes, and muscle tone, that defied expectation for a man of his reported age. Blood pressure remained within a normal range, digestion remained steady, and bones, though showing minor wear, bore the accumulated weight of decades with remarkable resilience. Cognitive function remained unbroken, an anomaly that inspired both wonder and unease. The data collected could neither fully explain nor diminish the phenomenon, leaving professionals to grapple with the reality that human biology might contain exceptions beyond their understanding. Each observation, carefully noted, contributed to a growing body of evidence that Elias Mason's life was both extraordinary and inexplicably grounded in reality. Beyond physical and cognitive attributes, his psychological presence was profound. He understood the social dynamics of the town, navigating interactions with subtlety, discretion, and foresight. He often anticipated questions, disputes, or confusions before they arose, intervening only when necessary to maintain harmony or provide guidance. In this way, his longevity became not only a biological anomaly but also a stabilizing force within the community. Neighbors relied on his experience without fully acknowledging the depth of insight he carried, adapting their behavior around his quiet authority. The town's awareness of his presence evolved into a kind of social rhythm, an implicit acknowledgement of a man who embodied both history and continuity in a way that others could neither replicate nor ignore. Folklore and legend naturally grew around his existence. Stories circulated quietly in homes and at marketplaces, blending fact and imagination into a narrative that reinforced the mystery. Some suggested divine blessing, others whispered of supernatural intervention or protective spirits. These tales, while rarely spoken aloud, shaped the perception of his life, creating a tension between rational observation and mythic speculation. Visitors from outside the region were both fascinated and unsettled, noting the peculiar reverence with which townspeople treated him and the subtle unease that accompanied each acknowledgement of his presence. It became clear that Elias Mason's life had transcended the ordinary, occupying a space where reality and legend intersected with quiet inevitability. His physical routines continued to impress and unsettle alike. He rose before dawn, walked the familiar paths of the town and surrounding countryside, and performed labor with consistency unmatched by men half his age. He repaired fences, tended gardens, and assisted neighbors with tasks that required strength and dexterity. The repetition of these actions, day after day, reinforced the perception of an unchanging vitality, as though the passage of time had no effect upon him. Observers could not discern a decline, each year seemed merely a continuation of the previous one, a steady persistence that challenged notions of aging and mortality. The town came to accommodate this reality, adjusting expectations and behavior to account for the presence of someone who defied temporal norms. Despite his integration into the rhythms of the town, isolation accompanied the persistence of his life. While he interacted regularly with neighbors, children, and travelers, there remained a distance, a subtle recognition that no ordinary person could fully comprehend the scope of his experience. Conversations often skirted the edges of his memory, touching only lightly on the extraordinary span of years he had witnessed. He would answer questions with care, never revealing the totality of his knowledge, maintaining a boundary that preserved both dignity and mystery. The weight of unbroken memory, the persistence of physical and cognitive resilience, and the quiet awareness of mortality surrounding him created a psychological environment that was both extraordinary and inherently solitary. By the mid-1910s, Elias Mason had become emblematic of the limits of human understanding. His life was recorded in private journals, oral histories, and occasional newspaper mentions, each account emphasizing endurance, memory, and observation without fully explaining them. Scholars and townspeople alike struggled to reconcile empirical data with the lived reality of a man who had survived decades beyond expectation. The tension between ordinary human comprehension and the impossible nature of his longevity became a defining feature of his existence. And through it all, he persisted with quiet dignity, moving through the town, engaging in daily routines, and maintaining a presence that was at once reassuring, astonishing, and impossible to fully comprehend. In Marietta, he remained a living paradox, the embodiment of endurance, memory, and mystery in equal measure. By the 1920s, the presence of Elias Mason had solidified into an unshakable reality for Marietta, his life casting a shadow across generations that could neither be denied nor fully understood. Streets, homes, and workplaces had been subtly adjusted over decades in recognition of his consistency and endurance. Observers remarked on his ability to perform labor far beyond the capacity of men half his age, to remember events long erased from records, and to maintain cognitive clarity that seemed almost impossible. Children who had once listened to his stories grew into adults themselves, passing along fragments of memory, anecdotes, and warnings about the extraordinary man whose life spanned more than a century. Each generation inherited both fascination and unease, the knowledge that a man existed among them whose life defied the ordinary rules that govern time and mortality. Medical inquiry continued, though in increasingly hushed tones. Physicians remained intrigued but cautious, unwilling to draw public attention to what would appear either miraculous or absurd. Blood pressure readings, pulse checks, and observations of reflexes continued to indicate a vitality that defied expectation, while cognitive tests revealed memory retention that spanned decades. Doctors privately documented anomalies, recording subtle changes over years yet finding that no decline matched the chronological expectations of age. They attempted to rationalize this through theories of diet, heredity, and lifestyle, but the persistence of his vitality exceeded all conventional explanation. In private journals, some questioned whether his longevity represented a biological miracle, an unrecognized mutation, or something beyond the grasp of contemporary science. The questions remained unanswered, the mystery persistent, and the man himself unfazed by scrutiny. Social dynamics reflected both accommodation and subtle reverence. Townspeople treated him with a mixture of respect, curiosity, and caution, recognizing that the ordinary rhythms of life did not fully apply to him. He would attend church services, contribute quietly to communal projects, and offer advice with understated authority, yet always maintained a distance that preserved both dignity and mystery. Conversations skirted the edges of his personal history, focusing instead on observable actions, mundane concerns, or practical guidance. Children approached with awe, while adults spoke in measured tones, aware that any misstep in recognition or interaction could disturb the delicate balance of perception that had developed over decades. In this, Elias Mason became not only a participant in the town's life but a symbol of enduring presence, an axis around which social understanding subtly rotated. The town's folklore continued to expand alongside empirical observation. Stories of his life were whispered in homes, marketplaces, and religious gatherings, merging fact with interpretation. Some suggested he had been blessed by divine intervention, others proposed unseen forces or ancestral protection as explanation. These narratives were never formalized, but they shaped collective understanding, blending reverence and fear. Visitors from neighboring towns, drawn by curiosity or rumor, often left unsettled by the duality of Elias's presence, entirely human in form, yet clearly extraordinary in function, a living testament to endurance, memory, and time itself. Each encounter reinforced the perception that he was both part of the world and somehow apart from it, occupying a space that challenged conventional understanding while remaining undeniably real. Physical routines persisted with remarkable consistency. He continued to rise before dawn, traverse familiar paths, and perform daily labor with unflagging strength. Neighbors observed the quiet precision of his movements, the steadiness of his gait, and the unbroken endurance that seemed to mock the limitations of age. Tasks that would exhaust ordinary men were completed with routine ease, hauling water, repairing fences, assisting with construction, and guiding younger laborers through complex work. These acts were understated, almost ritualistic, yet carried weight precisely because they revealed the continuity of life that others could neither maintain nor fully comprehend. His body, like his mind, remained an anomaly, functioning without the frailty that had overtaken peers, a constant reminder that the ordinary bounds of human endurance were not universally applicable. Psychologically, his presence continued to shape the town. His insights into human behavior, memory, and social dynamics influenced the rhythms of daily life, guiding interactions without explicit assertion. Neighbors adapted their behavior to his subtle cues, learning when to defer, when to ask questions, and when to simply observe. Children internalized lessons from his stories, absorbing both historical knowledge and implicit guidance on perseverance, observation, and discretion. Even the adults, aware of his longevity and extraordinary memory, recognized a stabilizing presence that encouraged caution, respect, and attentiveness. In this way, Elias Mason's existence became both a social anchor and a quiet disruptor, the axis around which the town's perception of normalcy subtly shifted. Attempts to document and explain his life persisted. Visitors recorded anecdotes, tested memory, and catalogued physiological data, yet each method encountered limits. Historical records corroborated some details but left gaps, empirical observation confirmed endurance but could not account for memory spanning decades, folklore supplied narratives but lacked verifiable evidence. The tension between observation and mystery intensified, leaving Marietta suspended between fascination and unease. Scholars, physicians, and curious travelers all departed with fragments of understanding, none able to fully reconcile the lived reality of Elias Mason with conventional frameworks. Each new visitor, each new observation, only deepened the paradox: a man lived among them, undeniably present, yet wholly impossible by ordinary measures. His solitude remained a quiet undercurrent beneath public perception. While integrated into daily routines and social interactions, he maintained boundaries that preserved both dignity and a sense of temporal separation. He reflected often on the span of his life, recalling events, people, and landscapes with clarity yet without overt exposition. In moments of quiet, he would revisit memories of plantations, river crossings, and towns long vanished, observing both the endurance and fragility of human life. This private engagement with the past added a subtle depth to his presence, reinforcing the sense that his existence encompassed both lived reality and an internal chronicle extending beyond the perception of ordinary witnesses. By the mid-1920s, Elias Mason's life had crystallized into a profound and unresolved mystery. The town of Marietta had learned to navigate its rhythms around him, incorporating his presence into the social fabric while preserving the cautious distance that decades of observation demanded. Scholars continued to document, physicians continued to measure, and folklore continued to grow, yet none fully captured the scale of his existence. Children and adults alike carried impressions of awe and uncertainty, the story of his life circulating in fragmented anecdotes and whispered speculation. He remained a living paradox, mortal in form, extraordinary in endurance, a bridge between centuries whose existence challenged assumptions, reshaped social norms, and offered a quiet but persistent lesson in the persistence of human memory, resilience, and the limits of understanding.